Will Trieu Duong be able to build a safe wooden guard around the bed in time to protect little Truc Lam as she begins to crawl? Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're following the heartwarming story of a father and his little daughter, Trieu Duong and Truc Lam. One quiet morning, after feeding Truc Lam milk, gently helping her burp, and changing her diaper, Trieu Duong suddenly realizes that she is growing faster every day. Soon she will start crawling, and lying alone on the bed could become dangerous. Wanting to keep her safe, he decides to build a sturdy wooden guard around the bed. With Truc Lam comfortably carried on his back, the two of them begin working, side by side, turning an ordinary day into a story filled with care, hard work, and a father's quiet love. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. The first light of morning slipped quietly through the wooden window and spread across the small room. Outside, the countryside was still calm, with only the soft sounds of chickens moving around the yard and a light breeze passing through the trees. Inside the house, everything was peaceful, until a small rustling sound came from the bed. Trieu Duong slowly opened his eyes and turned his head. Beside him, little Truc Lam had just woken up. Her tiny hands moved gently in the air as she stared at the ceiling, blinking as if she was trying to understand the new day beginning around her. When she finally noticed her father looking at her, her expression changed immediately. Her eyes brightened, and a small smile appeared on her face. Trieu Duong leaned closer and gently touched her cheek. "Good morning, little one," he said softly. However, Truc Lam had something much more important on her mind. Within a few seconds, her smile turned into a small, complaining sound. Then another one followed. Trieu Duong chuckled quietly because he understood exactly what that meant. It was breakfast time. He carefully lifted her into his arms and held her close to his chest. Truc Lam immediately relaxed against his shoulder, her tiny body warm and comfortable in his embrace. Trieu Duong walked toward the small wooden table where he had already prepared a bottle of warm milk. He had learned that mornings with a baby could be unpredictable, so preparing things in advance always made life a little easier. He sat down slowly and held the bottle to Truc Lam's lips. The moment the milk touched her mouth, she began drinking eagerly, as if she had been waiting for it all morning. Trieu Duong watched her quietly while she drank, feeling a calm sense of happiness fill the room. Outside, the sun was slowly rising, bringing gentle daylight into the house, while inside the only sound was the soft rhythm of Truc Lam drinking her milk. After a few minutes, the bottle was empty. Truc Lam looked satisfied, her small eyes blinking slowly. But Trieu Duong knew the routine was not finished yet. He carefully lifted her up and placed her against his shoulder. With one hand supporting her back, he gently patted her a few times. After several soft pats, a tiny burp escaped from her. Trieu Duong laughed softly. "Good job," he said with a warm smile. Next came the diaper change. He placed her gently back on the bed and reached for a clean diaper nearby. Truc Lam kicked her legs happily as he worked, completely unaware of how much effort it took to care for a baby properly. Fortunately, Trieu Duong had already become quite experienced with this task. His movements were careful but confident, making sure she stayed comfortable the entire time. When he finished, he lightly tapped her belly. "All done." Truc Lam responded with a small giggle, which made Trieu Duong smile again. For a moment, he simply sat there, watching her. She seemed a little stronger every day. Her movements were becoming more active, and her curiosity about the world was growing quickly. That thought suddenly made him pause. Right now, Truc Lam mostly stayed where he placed her, but that would not last forever. Soon she would start learning to roll over. After that, she would begin crawling. And when that day came, things could become dangerous if he wasn't careful. Trieu Duong looked at the bed thoughtfully. It wasn't very high, but it was still high enough for a baby to fall from. If Truc Lam rolled toward the edge while he was busy cooking or working outside, she could easily fall to the floor. The thought made him sit up straighter. He imagined the moment clearly in his mind. a curious baby exploring the bed, moving closer and closer to the edge without realizing the danger. One wrong movement could lead to a painful fall. Trieu Duong shook his head immediately. He could not allow that to happen. He looked around the room carefully, thinking about what he could do to make the bed safer. After a few moments, an idea came to him. If he built a wooden barrier around the sides of the bed, it would act like a protective crib wall. That way, even if Truc Lam learned to crawl or roll around, she would not be able to fall off. The more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. A sturdy wooden guard around the bed would give Truc Lam a safe space to move and play without danger. It wouldn't need to be complicated, just strong and secure enough to keep her protected. Trieu Duong stood up and walked outside to look around the yard. Near the chicken coop were several pieces of wood left over from earlier work. He examined them carefully and realized there was enough material to build what he had in mind. Of course, the project would still take time. He would need to measure the bed properly, cut the wood to the right size, and assemble the frame securely. If he started now, there was a good chance he could finish before nightfall. He turned back toward the house and looked through the doorway. Inside, Truc Lam was lying on the bed, happily waving her hands in the air as if she were playing with invisible toys. Trieu Duong smiled warmly. "Looks like we have a big job today," he said quietly. He walked back inside and gently lifted her again. This time, instead of holding her in his arms, he reached for a long cloth carrier hanging on the wall. Carefully, he placed Truc Lam against his back and tied the cloth securely around his shoulders and waist. Truc Lam quickly settled into the comfortable position. From there, she could see everything happening around her. Trieu Duong stepped outside into the morning sunlight with his daughter safely on his back. The air was fresh and cool, and the day felt full of possibility. He picked up the first piece of wood from the stack and looked down at it thoughtfully. "All right, Truc Lam," he said with a gentle smile. "Let's build something to keep you safe." With that, the two of them began working together, father and daughter, starting a long but meaningful day of building, care, and quiet happiness. With Truc Lam comfortably secured on his back, Trieu Duong walked toward the pile of wood near the chicken coop. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the yard and lighting up the simple space where most of their daily life unfolded. Chickens wandered nearby, scratching the ground and clucking softly, completely unaware that an important project was about to begin. Trieu Duong placed several wooden planks on the ground and studied them carefully. He needed pieces that were straight, strong, and long enough to create a protective barrier around the bed. This guard couldn't just look good. It had to be sturdy enough to keep Truc Lam safe once she began crawling. Behind him, Truc Lam watched everything with curious eyes. From her place on his back, she could see the movement of his hands, the wood being stacked, and the bright yard stretching out around them. Occasionally, she made small sounds, as if she were giving instructions for the project. Trieu Duong smiled when he heard her. "Don't worry," he said gently. "Your father knows what he's doing." The first step was measuring. He grabbed a simple measuring tape and returned inside the house. With careful attention, he measured the length and width of the bed several times to make sure the wooden guard would fit perfectly. If the frame was too loose, it wouldn't be safe. If it was too tight, it would be difficult to install. After writing the measurements down on a small piece of wood with a pencil, he stepped back outside. Now came the real work. Trieu Duong placed one plank across two stones and picked up his saw. The sharp teeth of the blade moved steadily through the wood as he cut the first piece to the exact length he needed. Sawdust fell slowly to the ground with each movement. Behind him, Truc Lam shifted slightly, her small hands moving as if she was trying to reach the falling dust. Trieu Duong laughed quietly. "Careful, little supervisor," he said. "You're here to watch, not to work." One by one, he cut several pieces of wood. Some would become the long, horizontal rails of the guard, while others would serve as the vertical bars that would keep Truc Lam from slipping through. He made sure the spacing between each bar would be narrow enough to protect her, but wide enough to allow air and light to pass through. The work was steady and physical. Every cut required patience and strength, but Trieu Duong didn't rush. Safety was more important than speed. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the yard slowly filled with the sounds of work, the scraping of wood, the tapping of nails, and the occasional happy babble from Truc Lam. Once the pieces were cut, Trieu Duong began assembling the frame. He placed two long boards parallel to each other and started attaching the vertical bars between them. Each nail was hammered carefully to keep the structure strong and stable. From time to time, he paused to adjust the cloth carrier and make sure Truc Lam was still comfortable. She seemed to enjoy the gentle rhythm of his movements. Sometimes she leaned her head against his back and watched the sky above them. Hours passed this way. Piece by piece, the wooden guards slowly began to take shape. By midday, Trieu Duong stepped back to examine the structure. It wasn't finished yet, but the frame was already visible. It looked simple, but strong, exactly what he had hoped for. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked up at the sky. The sun had moved well past the center of the day. There was still more work to do. Trieu Duong returned inside the house and placed the half-finished frame beside the bed to check the size. He adjusted one corner slightly and marked a few places where additional support pieces would be needed. Behind him, Truc Lam made a soft sound, almost like a tiny laugh. Trieu Duong turned his head slightly. "You think it looks good?" he asked. She responded by kicking her feet gently, which he decided meant approval. Encouraged by his daughter's silent support, he carried the frame back outside and continued working. He added several reinforcing pieces and smoothed the edges of the wood so there would be no sharp corners. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the golden sunlight stretched across the yard. The long shadows of the trees reached toward the house, reminding Trieu Duong that time was passing quickly. He glanced toward the horizon. If he wanted to finish before dark and still cook dinner, he needed to complete the final steps soon. With renewed focus, he lifted the finished wooden guard and carefully carried it inside the house. The structure was strong but not too heavy, which made installation easier. Trieu Duong placed it around the edges of the bed and secured it firmly to the frame. One by one, he tightened each connection point, testing the strength by gently pushing against the rails. The guard didn't move. Satisfied, he placed Truc Lam on the bed inside the new protective barrier. For a moment, she simply looked around in curiosity. The wooden rails formed a small, safe world around her, giving her space to move without danger. Trieu Duong gently rolled a small cloth ball toward her. She reached for it immediately. Her tiny hands grabbed the ball while she kicked her legs happily, completely unaware that the structure around her had just been built to protect her future adventures. Trieu Duong leaned against the wall and watched her play. A quiet sense of relief spread through his chest. Now, when Truc Lam learned to crawl, she would be safe. After a few minutes, he stepped outside again to prepare the evening meal. The sky was turning orange as the sun slowly dropped behind the hills. Smoke from the small cooking fire began to rise gently into the evening air. Behind him, inside the house, Truc Lam continued playing happily in her new safe space. The day had been long, full of hard work and careful effort. But as Trieu Duong stirred the pot over the fire and listened to his daughter's soft laughter from inside the house, he knew it had been worth every moment. Sometimes the most meaningful things in life were not the biggest projects or the grandest achievements. Sometimes they were simply the quiet acts of love that kept someone safe. And tonight, as darkness slowly settled over the peaceful countryside, Trieu Duong felt proud knowing that his daughter would sleep safely, protected by something built with his own two hands. One peaceful morning, Trieu Duong wakes up to the gentle sounds of his daughter, Truc Lam, beginning a new day. After feeding her milk, helping her burp, and carefully changing her diaper, he begins to realize how quickly she is growing. Soon, Truc Lam will learn to crawl, and leaving her alone on the bed could become dangerous. Wanting to keep her safe, Trieu Duong decides to build a sturdy wooden guard around the bed so she won't accidentally fall. With Truc Lam comfortably carried on his back, he gathers wood and begins working in the yard, measuring, cutting, and assembling the frame piece by piece. Throughout the day, father and daughter work together in quiet harmony. By evening, the protective guard is finally finished, creating a safe space where Truc Lam can play and grow while surrounded by her father's love and care.